Hello students, welcome to Module 6.2.5. We'll call this one Looking Ahead. One Earth, one experiment. The slide you see before you, we don't have another Earth on the shelf in the back room if we mess this one up, so we need to be cautious. There's something called the precautionary principle, and it's somewhat equivalent to a stitch in time saves nine, and it's the idea that it's easier to prevent problems than to try to repair them. And this is especially true of biodiversity, where so much of the wealth of our world and the enrichment of our lives and just the functioning of ecosystems lies. And so I guess one of the questions that comes to mind is, what should we do? And here are 4 steps that come from the famous biologist E.O. Wilson, who's at Harvard. He's kind of the spokesperson for biodiversity. And he says that, number 1, we need to survey the world's biodiversity, especially the flora and the fauna. Flora being all the plants and fauna being all the animals. This would be the equivalent of opening the presents. Survey that biodiversity and also survey which species have usefulness to us. Secondly, we need to create biological wealth. In other words, we need to make biological diversity pay. And so we can make biodiversity become a source of material wealth. If a forest is worth more standing than cut down, then hopefully it will stand, and that way it can create more wealth. There are many ways that this can happen, but think of harvesting products from a standing rainforest, taking out rubber, the rubber trees, and tapping the rubber, and the trees continue to stand. Think of taking out Brazil nuts. And there are many other materials that can make a forest more valuable than simply cutting it down or clear cutting it for all of its trees. We can even select cut and remove some trees and leave the forest standing where it will continue to function ecologically. Number 3, we need to promote sustainable development. Remember what the word sustainable means. It means able to continue generation after generation. And you might wonder, well, where do we have unsustainable development? Well, right here in the city of Sierra Vista, we are already overdrafting our groundwater. We're taking more water out of the aquifer. That's the source of our water for our municipal uses, than is going in. And that means that one day we will go to the faucet and turn it on and nothing will come out. Now this time is projected to be far in the future. We're talking many decades, but nevertheless the fact that we have development here and we continue to build houses even though we know that we're using more water than is being put back into the aquifer, this is really a disturbing trend. Step number 4 says save what remains. Think, for example, of old growth forests that have never been cut before. We've cut well over 90% of them, and so the few forests that remain, the ancient forests, shouldn't be cut. Forests have disproportionate importance for biological diversity, and we should save these forests. We should strengthen the Endangered Species Act. We should support it. In the times before the Endangered Species Act, we would have business development threatening all sorts of species. And so the Endangered Species Act is an important shield for biodiversity against economic development. We also need to change attitudes. Carefully consider the number of kids you want to have. Remember how large the ecological footprint is of Americans compared to others. Here's another view of things. This is from someone whose name was Barry Commoner. he was a professor at George Washington University in St. Louis. He actually ran for president back in, I want to say, 72, something like that. But he was not a serious candidate from the point of view that he could win, but he had a very serious platform, and it was all about the environment. He wrote a book called The Closing Circle, and in that book, he gave us 4 laws of ecology for the average person. And law number 1 was the fact that everything must go somewhere. Sometimes we think about throwing things away, but Barry Commoner said that there is no way. Take, for example, batteries in a remote control for your television. It used to be, until very recently, that those batteries contained mercury, and mercury, of course, is subject to biological magnification. So when he threw, quote, away, end quote, those batteries, they didn't really go away, but in fact they went to a landfill, and in that landfill there could be a liner which prevents materials in the landfill from leaking into our groundwater, but in fact liners fail and mercury could end up in our groundwater, just so we could change a TV channel. Number 2, everything is connected to everything else. It was the naturalist John Muir that said something like this. He said, when you grab one little piece of nature, you find that everything else is attached. And there is a great connectivity among life, and we need to be aware of that and be aware of the great difficulty in trying to just tweak one little piece, that such an action can affect the whole. Point number 3 is that Mother Nature knows best. And this is difficult for humans because we have a hard time being humble. We talk about R&D. R&D stands for research and development. And sometimes a business leader will take great pride and say, we researched this for 15 years or something like that. But understand how much greater the R&D is of nature and evolution over thousands and thousands of generations. These interactions and these ecosystems have been fine-tuned. And for us to suppose that we can go in and put it together is ludicrous. It is together. What we can do is screw things up. And so we need to be humble in the face of that which sustains us. And so we really do need to understand that nature is where we get the essentials of life, and that if we mess it up, we have one earth, one experiment. We don't have a backup. And of course, the 4th point here says that there is no such thing as a free lunch. And this was, of course, the idea that someone pays somewhere sometime. And one of the concepts of modern corporate business world is to externalize costs, and so that the cost that is accrued to the shareholders and to the corporation aren't the true costs, and rather that those costs are borne by someone else. For example, the cost of pollution. If a corporation pollutes, then it doesn't have to pay for pollution abatement, like scrubbers on a smokestack or something like that. And then everyone breathes, and we have higher rates of lung disease or something like that. And that's an externalization of the cost, and that happens all the time. And so this idea that there's no such thing as a free lunch is an important idea. Let me kind of wrap up by referring to and reading from a book called The View from Bald Hill. Now, as you look at the cover of the book in the lower left here, that might look familiar. Those are the Mustang Hills, and this is out near Mustang Corners. And this is, in fact, a book that's written about the Audubon Appleton Whittle Research Ranch, which is to the west of Fort Huachuca. And it's really a marvelous book. It talks mostly about ecology of this area. So this is really written by 2 fine ecologists from the University of Colorado who have been coming down here for 30 years. If you look at the subtitle, it's called 30 Years in an Arizona Grassland. And as I say, the chapters, they have chapters on plants and chapters on birds and chapters on mammals and chapters on fire and chapters on weather. So it's really about science for the most part. But there's one chapter called The World is Full of Life, which is their concluding chapter, which I'm going to use kind of as a conclusion for our class. It really has some of the messages that you should take away. And I'm going to read just a couple of pages from that to conclude our class. And this is from the chapter, The World is Full of Life. It is an irrefutable fact of biology that all living things, including humans, have a genetically predetermined capacity to overwhelm the universe with their own numbers and to do it quickly. That is why the world is full of life. All the opportunities are quickly filled because there is always some organism out there whose offspring need the space. Lots of landscapes in the American West may look empty, but that is an illusion. Even here, all the good spots are being used by something right now. All living things survive only at the expense of some other living things, either because those other living things are food or equally often because they are the competition. These facts are neither new nor obscure, but they are easily ignored or forgotten unless you live in the natural world and are watchful. These facts also undermine some of our most cherished urban myths, the central and most dangerous one being that all the human things we care most about, our families and our institutions, can keep on getting bigger forever. A debate is currently raging about the seriousness of global human population growth. No rational person could deny that there must be some upper limit to our numbers, given that the earth is finite. Most people also would agree that there is a negative relationship between the numbers of us trying to occupy the globe and the quality of our individual lives. The debate centers on what, if anything, to do about it. One view holds that strident calls for global population control are simplistic and thinly disguised attempts to perpetuate economic, sexist, and racist policies invented by white males to retain their world dominance. According to this view, once racial, gender, and cultural equalities become real, the population problem somehow will take care of itself. We are skeptical. Perhaps it is because we live in a place in Colorado where most of the people are wealthy, obscenely wealthy by world standards, where racial and gender relationships are reasonably good, and where the mostly well-to-do and mostly white human population is growing absolutely out of control. It matters little to us that this growth is due largely to immigration from other parts of the United States rather than being the result of local reproduction. All those people are coming from somewhere, and those places would be a mess if there weren't so many people leaving. I'm going to skip a paragraph and continue. It says, we suspect that living in true harmony with the natural world in a manner sustainable over the long run is something no modern human society has yet learned how to do. The survival of the natural world, however, and likely our survival as a species, depends on our learning to do this. It will be a unique experience in human history. Most thoughtful ecologists and conservation biologists are not sure it is possible. That is why so many of us are grumps, why some few of us become anarchists, and why some of us just go fishing and skiing. Another urban myth holds that humans can live in the world and do no harm to it as long as they are sufficiently virtuous. For example, some individuals take pride in the fact that they live without killing other animals. Now, if we eat hamburgers made from steers that grazed on the grasslands of the Sonoyta Valley, we certainly have lived at the expense of some grassland plants and animals, but probably not at the expense of all of them. On the other hand, if we convert the Arizona high plains into soybean fields and vineyards, the grasslands are lost. All the native plants and animals that used to be there are dead and gone forever. They can't just move to some other place because that place is already taken. We can live only at the expense of other lives, but this selfishness is not a human attribute. It is an inescapable characteristic of all living things. What is uniquely human is not our striving to numerically dominate the world, but our historic success. We should not despair or stop living, but neither should we live without regard for the consequences of our collective abundance or our individual behavior. There is no ethical paradox here. Life is too good to pass up, but ever-increasing human life, not shared with the natural world, becomes ecologically doomed at some point and spiritually bankrupt long before then. For billions of years, the rules of the game have been that whoever has the most kids wins. We are an evolutionary consequence of that game, and now we are so good at it that we are overwhelming the world, simply crushing it with our collective numbers and greed. Coming to grips with the reality of population growth is so horrifying that we will go to almost any lengths to deny it. We point to the fact that most of the world is still unoccupied. We pontificate that limiting our own abundance is somehow immoral, instead of simply being contrary to our inherent reproductive drives. We point to our undeniable skill at finding new technologies and pronounce those urging restraint as doomsayers. We forget that the world already is full of life, and we kill the messenger who reminds us. It may be bitter medicine, but if we are to survive ecologically and spiritually, we must now change the rules of the game. We must come to our reproductive senses before it is too late. Meanwhile, those of us who cannot live without a view have a choice. We can run away at once, looking over our shoulders and looking ahead, hoping to find one more place that has not yet been obliterated by the tide. Or we can draw a line across the plains in the savannas we love so much and take a stand. And that is The World is Full of Life by Carl and Jane Bach. That's the conclusion to their book, and that will serve as an admirable conclusion to our class here. I'd like to thank you for your time. Here is a little bit of the summary of what I've read, but not a complete summary. But I thank you for your participation in the class. Prepare well for the final. Here's a couple slides. It says, of course, this is showing the oil slick out in the Gulf of Mexico. There's New Orleans, and that's where the offshore platform was leaking. 5,000 barrels per day that could increase to 60. And of course, it did increase a bit, but they did cap it. This is showing more of the slick. This is showing from this tsunami that hit Japan and the nuclear power plant that was leaking radiation. And so these are things that go on, and of course we have to be aware and watchful. In any case, thank you very much, and with that we will conclude both this module and this class. Prepare well for your final exam.